Hello! Show your support for reparations for Black people now. Hi, welcome, friend. My name is Noah. I am the founder of Imani Safehouse, Inc., a graduating Master of Social Work at the Hunter Silberman School of Social Work, and the author of a policy brief advancing reparative justice and structural equity for Black communities. I also support the Afro-Socialist Caucus of the Democratic Socialists of America. We are doing this reparative work for equity now because the harm was not accidental. The transatlantic slavery was engineered. It was legislated. It was profitable, and its consequences did not end with emancipation. The harm, repeated across generations, evident in housing, in wealth, in health, in incarceration, in economic opportunity. Today, Black communities continue to experience disparities that were shaped and built over centuries and have never, ever been fully repaired. Because the harm was structured, the consequences became structural. And because the consequences remain structural, repair must be structural too. And that is why this conversation matters. And because the harm was structured, repair must also be structured. That is why this event matters. The film reminded us that structural violence is not abstract. It lives in homes, it moves through families, it shapes the daily fight for survival. And over time, it settles in the body as an allostatic load. Diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, and chronic stress carried across generations. And here, the discussion challenged us to move beyond acknowledgement of these issues towards responsibility, toward reparations. Because systems do not repair themselves. Only we, the people united, can repair systems.
Hello, I am Simone Baptiste, and I'm the director of $16,000. I will keep this short and sweet. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there with you all today to discuss it, but I do encourage a very spirited discussion about this film and about reparations in general. And what I will say is that this film is meant to be provocative. I think you'll be able to tell, or if you've watched it already, you know. But what I will say is that we wanted to show the worst case scenario for reparations, and I think sometimes showing that helps to determine what do we want it to actually look like if reparations were to take place in modern times. And so we made this back in 2019 before George Floyd protests, and this was in response to the 2020 election cycle where we had a lot of Democratic candidates talking about reparations, and none of them were talking about a real plan about it, and it was a bargaining chip for the Black vote. And so in order to take the conversation back, we did this film in conjunction with the DSA fund to essentially paint a picture, and the film ended up speaking to a lot of people, and I'm very glad for that. And I think that this is definitely a touchstone piece that I enjoy showing with students, I enjoy showing with socialist organizations, I enjoy showing to anybody, because I think sometimes comedy is a great unifier for people, and it's a great way to disarm people when you're talking about subject matters like this one. So thank you again. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions after the fact. I'm happy to do a Q&A offline. So you can get my email from Noah, and have fun.
Before you hear from our panelists, I want to briefly introduce the framework that has guided our discussion today. It is a three-pillar framework that was developed through the work of Imani Safehouse, Inc., and is grounded in a simple premise: if harm was structured, then repair must also be structured. The framework asks not only how we acknowledge historical harm, but how we build policies capable of producing equity, stability, and guarantees of non-repetition. And it was my honor to introduce a panel whose work spans social work, organizing, public policy, infrastructure, advocacy, and lived experience. Each one had a unique perspective to the questions before us. Questions of responsibility, repair, justice, and structural transformation. We welcomed Dr. Urina Anewuchi, researcher, engineer, and advocate whose work examines infrastructure, equity, and energy access, and the relationship between public systems and community well-being. Trevor Griffiths, DSW, LCSW, CASACM, KSEC-M, social work leader, and senior program director at Lantern Community Services, whose work centers trauma-informed care, re-entry, and pathways to stability for individuals impacted by incarceration. He has lived experience also. Trevor Smith, strategist and organizer with the Bliss Collective, advancing Black liberation, indigenous sovereignty through movement building, political education, and community organizing from New York to California. And Robert Cuffey, community advocate, Hunter College graduate, and supporter of the Afro-Socialist Caucus of the Democratic Socialists of America, whose work explores racial justice, political engagement, and collective liberation. Stanley Jamel Bellamy, better known as Jamel, organizer and advocate with the Release Aging People in Prison campaign, also known as RAP, whose leadership brings critical insight into decarceration, human dignity, and the lived realities of incarceration and reentry. Together, these panelists represent a wealth of knowledge, experience, and commitment to building future. It consists of 3 pillars. First, female Black trust funds, an investment framework centered on the stability, safety, dignity, and economic well-being of Black females, cis and trans, through their life cycle. Second, housing, property ownership, recognizing that housing, especially ownership, is not only shelter, but a foundation for family stability for generations, political influence, health outcomes, and generational wealth. And third, constitutional repair, examining the legal and institutional structures that emerged from slavery and asking what changes are necessary to prevent the recurrence of slavery and the harm it has caused. Together, these pillars have moved the conversation beyond acknowledgement and towards structural.
You can join New Yorkers for Reparations. We're a multiracial coalition, Black-led, but multiracial coalition. And we need as many New Yorkers to support reparations as possible. So wanted to start there. The second thing that I wanted to say before answering the question real quick is 80% of Black people support reparations.
The Female Black Trust Fund is the first pillar, and it asks, what would happen if society invested in Black women with the same seriousness that society has historically extracted from them? Black women's bodies were used to reproduce enslaved labor. Now Black women disproportionately bore the burden of raising and sustaining communities impacted by incarceration. They need comparable investments in their stability because their stability is family stability.
And then when you're a Black woman in that field, there's a lot more that you have to fight for and fight with. Or fight for, not with. A lot of times you don't even get support from others who look like you. It's that you're fighting constantly by yourself. So I think that there would be power in providing financial support for Black women. I wanted to speak about financial literacy on if we were to provide, and we've talked about this earlier, if we were to provide money and just say, here's money that you need, but if you don't know the value of that money, it's not going to go far. I think what we need to do is set people up to succeed. The strategy is and should be that there will be money accessible to certain people. Sometimes I've asked myself, what should the criteria be? Vocational rehabilitation is one area that I think needs to be focused on. There's a claim that women are more emotional than men. Whether it's true or not, I think that women are very likely to be I'm trying to be, say this diplomatically, but very nurturing, right? And a lot of times take on more than they can handle. So I had a mental health professional speak during one of my webinars, and she spoke and she said specifically that married Black women are some of the most stressed out women in the world, not just in Africa, not just in the US, but in general. And you're dealing with emotional stuff, so you're carrying a lot of the weight of the family. And these days, a lot of Black women are earning higher, so they're working really tough jobs. They're coming home and taking care of their spouses if they're married, and taking care of children. You have lots of single mothers as well. I think that having a backup, to know that there's a trust fund for you would be very encouraging, but it would be helpful to those who have a willingness and desire to work. I think that for myself, for instance, if someone just gave me a $10,000 check every month and said, don't do anything, many things would go wrong. I mean, in the beginning it might feel good, maybe travel to Jamaica and travel to, whatever, and spend the money. But after a while, you start to lose your sense of self. I think that in addition to a trust fund, I think some kind of opening with how job placements would be very, very important. I talked to a German executive about sponsoring an event that I have coming up, and he said, I might not be able to give you money, but I can offer you jobs for the people that you want to, work with me. And I said, well, that's way more important to me, that he would give them jobs that they can work for and get money out of, than for him to just hand me money. So that's something that I feel like would help build legacy. And I think in the end, that's what it's all about for Black women, is how we help build legacy.
Thank you. Anyone else want to answer that?
I think the answer is no.
Okay, so go in. So why you say that?
One, a trust fund that is designed specifically just for Black women, it's not going to fly in New York City. It's not. There's too much ignorance, there's too much hatred. Right? When you see a young Black woman pushing a stroller, more likely than not, you presume that it's because there's no partner. That comes from ignorance and the stereotype. I think education has always got to be the foundation. I have 4 sisters, all right? They used to beat me up when I was little. So I tell them now, right? I've seen some of the struggles that they have gone through. Right? 2 of them are married, 2 of them are not. 2 of them have kids, and 2 of them don't. It hurts me to see one of my sisters go out for something that she's more qualified for than the other candidate, right? When we get a chance to look at their resumes, and still get passed over. Money won't help that, right? to shift their mindset towards that. That comes with education. You can't throw money at that problem. In New York City, they were taught that, hey, if you had babies and no man in the house, we'd give you a welfare check. That would have led to the destruction of black families. They gave them money. People kept having babies, but no one taught our women that, hey, the check doesn't equal love. Right? We didn't educate them. We didn't tell them from the beginning, hey, you're beautiful, you're worthy. You don't need him. He needs you. So a trust fund doesn't fix that. I really don't believe that money can fix that issue.
So what I'll say is, I think to answer the question, like, yes, and to add, and then I'll also add some nuance into it. So where I'll start is that there's in New York City and across the country, there's an affordability crisis, period. And so families, mothers, just cannot afford to live, which we obviously understand people here in America. So why I say yes is because there are universal models for this. So in New York, there's a new policy passed called Baby Bucks, which is going to provide families with newborn, I think it's the first 3 months, maybe 6 months of the child's life with funding. In Connecticut was the first state to pass a baby bonds policy. So baby bonds creates a government fund for newborns who are born underneath a certain income threshold, and they invest into that account when they're 18 years old. The baby, the teenager, has an opportunity to use that savings fund for down payment on a house or to college. And so, there are models for this, and I think from an ethical standpoint, countrywide, it's important for us to understand the insidiousness of chattel slavery, which was very specific to the U.S., and how black women were seen and treated as chattel, and there were literal farms that existed across the country that were made to just pump more black babies out, which was more labor. So I think it is very important to understand the insidiousness of chattel slavery in the U.S. It's important to me that there are universal models that are taking specific accounts to children and mothers, and I think it is about the family structure. I think we should be thinking about the family unit and black families as a whole. We have to name the particular harms that have happened to black women, but the economy is complicated, and it is racist towards black people in general. So one of the stats that I like to throw out the most is in 99% of neighborhoods across the U.S., black boys, no matter their income level, whether they grew up in a high-income household or a low-income household, they will always earn less than a white boy who grew up in the same neighborhood as them. So whether you're the son of LeBron James or whether you're the son of a McDonald's worker, if you're a black boy, you will always earn less. So the data shows that. That comes from Raj Chetty. And so there's something particularly going on in the economy for black boys. It's not the same for black women. So there's something insidious going on within the economy for black boys. So we have to have a nuanced understanding of the way this racial capitalism works. And I think the other tension that's coming across in all of our remarks is, should we be trying to fit reparations within the current capitalist structure, which is what I think we need to figure ourselves out. Because if you try to fit reparations within the current capitalist structure, because how predatory our current economic system is, it's not going to work. And so the bigger question is, how do we transform the economy in totality? That to me is like the bigger question around reparations.
Thank you so much. The second pillar is housing and property ownership, because housing is not only shelter. Housing is empowering. Housing determines educational access, political influence, family stability, health outcomes, generational wealth, When communities are denied ownership for generations through redlining, displacement, predatory lending, and unequal policy designs, the damage compounds across decades, and outcomes become visible in disproportionate representation of Black people within homeless shelters, public hospitals, foster care, and prisons. That means repair must be durable, not temporary or individual, but structural. Structural to produce systemic change, because housing is not only about belonging. Housing is life or death.
British, and when they left the North in charge of power. So right now it says it's a democracy, but it's not completely a democracy. For a long time, the people on the South felt marginalized. They were not put into leadership, and they wanted that to change. So they rose up in the 1960s to fight against the North. Unfortunately, all the food used to come from the North, so the North would ship food to the South. During the war, they stopped doing that. A lot of the Southerners who were in the North and in the West had a lot of money in banks. During that war, all their money was taken away. So you find people who don't want to put money in the banks because they still have trauma from back in the 60s, that what if I put my money in the bank and a war happens, then I don't have anything. So you will see people who never live in the southern part of the country, but they buy land and they build houses. They would go to the house maybe once every 2 or 3 years, but they would build like 5-bedroom houses, huge houses, but it just made them feel like they belong. So there's something powerful in land ownership and in home ownership that I think the Blacks in New York State would benefit from. But again, I think that without education, it won't go as far as it possibly can.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I think the answer is yes, but I don't know if the answer is yes to just home ownership. If you live in New York City, you notice that in Queens there's a lot of houses, right? There's brownstones in Brooklyn, right? There's some brownstones in Manhattan. The homes in the Bronx and the North Bronx. But most of New York City, where we live, is project buildings, tenement buildings, right? The projects were built as part of the redlining conversation. You stack everybody on top. And it worked. It worked. It was successful. You locked people of color into this marginalized space. You didn't have a choice but to live on top of each other. And we grew comfortable doing it. Nobody's going to take back Central Park. It's not going to happen. Right? They're not going to demolish the projects because where would all of those people go? I think that home ownership is great. But first we have to have a home. And that doesn't have to be a 5-bedroom home. It can be a studio apartment that belongs to you, that you can leave. Maybe to your kid, to your niece, to whatever. But it belongs to you. It's your space. The same space that we now pay rent in. Right? But like the sister said, it comes with education. Because they can give you the down payment, broker's fee, all of that. If you don't know how to manage your money, if you're not used to and not having learned how to own your space, eventually you will lose it. It will feel like you just gave it away. But you did.
Thank you. Robert?
So I just wanted to kind of tie together some of the pieces, like some of the historical things that we're talking about and the current situation. Like from my perspective, like I'm Guyanese, right? So when you say reparations, like in the film, like when they were joking about the Africans, technically I would get the 60,000. But part of why reparations is such an important tool in the struggle for abolition in the better world is because it has like worldwide consequences from Africa itself, where African slaves were taken from, to the Caribbean, where the emancipation movement there and the abolition of slavery actually led the British government to compensate slave owners to the tune of what was 20 million pounds at the time, which is the equivalent of like 16 or 17 billion pounds today, right? So if we make a claim for reparations in the Caribbean, we can point to a direct figure, a direct cost to say, no, why not give this back to the development of the Caribbean today? And to tie that into the American context, that's why we talk about 40 acres and a mule here, because it's linked to the actual Civil War in this country. When the Civil War was ending in 1865, General Sherman did his march to the sea in Georgia, where he went from Atlanta to Savannah, pretty much just raising a trail and getting rid of everything he could to destabilize the Confederate economy. And as he did this, he ended up getting a trail of now freed blacks following his army for protection. So when they did finally make it to Georgia, they made it to Savannah, they captured Savannah, they had to have a meeting with the elders in the black community saying, what do you want? How do we address this problem? And they said 40 acres. And then they came up with also a compromise, well, we'll give you a mule to work these 40 acres. Unsurprisingly, about a year later, that compromise got kicked out the door by the president at the time, and we've never really had that 40 acres. So when we talk about home ownership today, I think we have to be a bit realistic, right? About not just what redlining has done, but if we're in New York City where the majority of people are actually renters, housing justice doesn't just look like home ownership. And even those black homeowners that they're under attack through things like deed theft, right? We've seen a very recent example where City Council member Chiose got arrested trying to defend the black family from having their deeds stolen in like Bed-Stuy, which is popular for black home ownership, and the brownstones that now have all this equity in them that everyone is after. So I say all this to say, every time you talk about reparations, it comes about through fundamental transformation in society. Like things are changing. One type of society is kind of leaving and another is being birthed. And I think that while the reparations commissions we have are good steps forward, to see a fundamental change in society, it won't just be, people in the legislature making recommendations, but more like people in this room and in society coming together, kind of like we did in the Black Lives Matter movement, to kind of demand the kind of transformation we want to see.
So we call that gap between support and belief the hope gap, and we need to close that hope gap in talking about mindsets. We need folks to see that reparations is possible and know of all the reparations work happening across the country. And then the city that I often cite, so to answer the question, yes, housing should definitely be a part of reparations. One of my mentors, Robin Lee Simmons, she's from Evanston. They were one of the first citywide reparations efforts in the country. They used marijuana tax, revenue from marijuana tax to fund their reparations efforts. And folks who were the victims of redlining and their descendants received monetary compensation for redlining. And so here in New York, there's also a history of that. But I think like the bigger question as it relates to housing is land. And so we're not too far from Central Park, which was once called Seneca Village. And Seneca Village used to be a thriving black community. It's actually the first place in the country that was taken away, or eminent domain was utilized as a public policy to take it away. And so eminent domain is when the city or state says, we're gonna take this land for public good. And so what was once a thriving black community got taken out, and then obviously now Central Park is acres and acres and brings in millions, if not billions of dollars in revenue every year. So housing should definitely be a part of it, but to me, I'd love for us as citizens of New York City, New York State, to have a larger question around land, and what does it look like to return land, and that question would obviously need to tie into the original stewards of this land. So we're on Lenape-Hoking right now. So what would land return look like for both black and indigenous communities is a question that we grapple with at Bliss.
Thank you.
I'll be very brief. Yes is the answer. But we have to recognize that one thing in New York State, when we talk about if you're going to give reparation and housing, home ownership be a part of it, New York State tax for your property. So if you're going to put home ownership, land in it, you have to take away the taxes, because that is what creates generational wealth. When you have your home, you have equity. So if you're not paying taxes, and I say that if they're going to do that, we shouldn't have to pay taxes for 100 years.
400.
Yes, for 100 years to allow the wealth gap to be, closed. Because the whole thing, as you pass on intergenerational poverty, you can also pass on intergenerational wealth. And by not paying taxes on land, that is a way to save money, build up your equity, and you can pass that on to the next generation. Because when you buy land, you buy homes in New York State, you don't own it. If you don't pay the taxes, they can take your land, they can take your home. So you basically just still renting, paying a mortgage, and passing that on. You can use it to get a loan, you can use it to do whatever, but you don't own it. So the part of the reparations should be about land ownership, home ownership, and no taxes.
Thank you.
Professional development. With regards to home ownership, it's important that I think that it should be part of the package, though I feel like it will not go far without some kind of education on home ownership. So for instance, like teaching financial literacy, it's important to also get like home ownership literacy. I remember when I first passed my PhD candidacy exam, and I was so excited, and I went to my advisor and I said I passed the exam, because he thought I wasn't going to be able to pass it on the first try. He said, "Why are you excited? It just means that the work is just beginning. You have so much work to do." And I was like, "Can I just enjoy a little bit?" But he was kind of right. It's one thing to say get a check for a down payment, but you still have the rest of the life of the house to pay for. And the last thing that you want is to be sent off for failure. Right? So you get a house, the house can't be foreclosed, and that's not a good thing. So a good understanding of what that looks like is important. Also, land ownership. There's something about it that makes you feel like you belong. I think if the blacks in New York State had land, it would help them, just the feeling of belonging. In the 1960s in Nigeria, there was a war between
Before we can talk seriously about constitutional repair, we have to understand what slavery had become in American law. By the time of the 1850s and 1860s U.S. Census, slavery was no longer simply an economic institution. It became a racialized legal category. The census separated, yes, our U.S. Census, you can check it out, separated populations into categories such as white, free-colored, and slave, which meant that, in practice, the legal category of slave had become directly associated with people of African descent. That matters because slavery did not merely organize labor, it organized power, it organized status, and it did that to subjugate. It organized who could own property, who could exercise rights, who could participate fully in society, and who could be subjected to state control. Over generations, the institutions helped create white hierarchy in which blackness became associated with legal subordination and exclusion. And if we're serious about repair, we must be honest about that history, because the harm was not race neutral. The institution itself became profoundly racialized. And that brings us directly to the third pillar, constitutional repair. The 13th Federal Constitutional Amendment abolished slavery, however, preserving it through an exception. neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, and that exception did not exist in a vacuum. Following emancipation, new systems emerged that allowed forms of coercive labor and racialized control to continue through criminalization, convict leasing, prison labor, segregation, and other mechanisms of state control. The question is whether the legal and institutional structures that followed reproduce some of the same patterns of exclusion, extraction, and containment under new names. Not remembrance alone, not symbolism alone, but structural changes that ensure the conditions that produce the harm cannot continue to produce it. This is what the UN means by their fifth principle on reparations, non-recurrence. Because repair is not only about what happened, it is about what we are willing to prevent from happening again. Before our panelists could answer any questions about the 13th Federal Constitutional Amendment, we were cut short because we ran over time. So you can decide for yourself what you think about the 13th Federal Constitutional Amendment, and you can support reparations by using your voice, your vote, your institution, and your resources. Learn the history. Share the research, support reparative policy at the city, state, and federal level, hold elected officials accountable, fund Black-led and survivor-led organizations doing repair work. Bring this conversation into classrooms, unions, agencies, faith spaces, nonprofits, and community boards. Challenge policies that reproduce racial harm. Reparations requires more than belief. It requires organized public will. Thank you. And here is Stanley Jamel Bellamy, better known as Jamel, one of our esteemed panelists and inspiration to many. After being granted clemency by New York Governor Kathy Hochul, he transforms his lived experience into advocacy and leadership. Having experienced injustice before incarceration, like so many others, then incarceration itself firsthand, he survived systems that often punish and destroy people for their circumstances, for the circumstances of their survival. Today, he brings in valuable insight into the human impact of the criminal legal system, re-entry, and the pursuit of justice. He now uses his voice to advocate for decarceration, human dignity, and the freedom of others who remain impacted by incarceration and systemic inequality.